Welcome to The Good Oil, where we dive deep into the science and real-world application of DHA. I'm your host, Bassam Hallak. In this episode, we're exploring the evolving role of DHA in elite sport, from how sports nutrition has changed over time to where it is heading next. I'm joined by three leaders shaping performance nutrition in Australia: Dr. Gregory Peoples, Associate Professor at the University of Wollongong; Nicola Jaffrey, Sports Dietitian at the St. George Illawarra Dragons; and Eliza Freney, who's the National Head of Performance Nutrition at Rugby Australia. Today, we'll start by unpacking how sports nutrition frameworks have evolved and where Omega-3, particularly DHA, now fit into high-performance environments. Welcome, Eliza, Nicola and Greg.
Thanks for having us.
Excellent. Well, let's get started. Nicola, we'll start with you. As a dietitian working in elite rugby athletes, how have you seen the sports nutrition evolve over the past few years?
I think it's grown. I think it's a growing area, which is really nice. There's a lot of push for it to be valued and respected as a space that can be beneficial to not just performance but health. And I think that we're moving into that space a little more. So traditionally, sports nutrition, fueling recovery, feeding the athletes, making sure they can perform on the field. But I think it's evolved a little bit in the last few years to be more applicable in other areas that indirectly impact performance. So injury prevention, rehabilitation, concussion. There's lots of areas where we're seeing the benefit of sports nutrition and how it can be applicable, not just from a what can we do from you so you don't get fatigued on the field.
Yeah. And Eliza, from your perspective, in your role as the head of performance nutrition at Rugby Australia, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you see in the way that nutrition supports high performance outcomes, today?
I think in a team sport environment, the hardest challenge is just access and time to the athlete to be able to give them the best opportunity to evolve their performance nutrition. But with that, one of the opportunities I think that is fast evolving is the ability to become more prescriptive because of our ability to do more accurate testing, or the way that technology is evolving to make nutrition more individualised. It has the, I think, ability to really change the landscape of how a sports dietitian can influence an athlete's performance nutrition.
Yeah. But so if you consider, and I'm asking you both, Nicola and Eliza, if we consider the three main components of diet, which is carbohydrates, protein and fat, traditionally in what contexts has dietary fat been part of the overall performance nutrition conversation?
I don't want to talk on Nicola's behalf, but I wonder if there might be a bit of a synergy in our opinions, that it's always been part of the conversation, but it's not been a very big part of the conversation. It's sort of carbohydrates are the poor cousin to protein, and fats are the even poorer cousin to the both of them.
Yeah.
They're there, but there hasn't been a really intentional focus on them, and part of that is because of the amount of noise online, particularly social media. Protein has been having a moment for a long time, and when you've only got a finite amount of time to be able to spend with a player really sort of targeting their nutrition, it just doesn't seem to get the platform that it probably deserves, and I think that's going to evolve very quickly with some of the work that we've been doing.
I think fat, particularly on an individual level, has been mostly around meeting energy requirements. That's where it comes into the equation, and supporting hormonal health and immunity and all those things. But it's sort of a tool that we can use to increase energy requirements, but it's never, like Eliza said, it's never really been a big focus of education, particularly when time and resources are limited with how much you can give players.
Yeah. And how do you both see Omega-3, in particular DHA, fitting in this framework?
In a very exciting way.
Yeah.
It's something that we can measure and be really black and white about. You're suboptimal or you're optimal, and we can look at your dietary intake and infer if you're getting enough through food sources or if you potentially need a supplement. And we know that Omega-3 and DHA in particular in athletic populations has such a meaningful influence on health and as a byproduct performance. So it's a a really exciting, I think, opportunity to be able to become a lot more targeted about it.
Is there a growing awareness, with players and coaches about the role of DHA in their performance and recovery? I mean, is it real or is it still in its infancy stage?
There definitely is at our club. We've had Greg in a few times to do some talks with the players, and coaches have sat in on that. More so probably than coaches, the performance staff have been the ones to get on board. And just once there is a greater understanding of how it helps, but not only how, just the amount of the vast different areas that it helps with, once people start to understand that, and particularly the performance team, it's like light bulbs everywhere of, oh my gosh, we could help in all these different areas.
Yeah.
That's when they really started to get on board. And then once the players understood a little bit of that, but also we started doing the testing, and once there's any sort of competition involved, then they're on board to see whose levels are where and who can increase the most, etc. There has definitely been buy-in from our squad for sure.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I think what Nicola's done at Dragons is a fantastic case study of how we can take information and make meaningful behaviour change and elicit performance outcomes. Whereas in the general population and even at the elite performance level, there is still a lack of understanding of Omega-3, and there's particularly a lack of understanding of DHA. And when I started on this journey of getting a lot deeper into Omega-3 research, I myself as a sports dietitian was not at the level of understanding I am now between, say, the difference between EPA and DHA, effective doses, the systems of the body that it really influences, and the need to be a little bit more targeted about that. That I think is the next evolution of Omega-3 understanding.
Okay, great.
So, Bassam, if I can jump in, this is a really interesting example. If you step back to fat, we often sort of group it together, and at best we start to break it down into some preliminary subdivisions, so monounsaturated or polyunsaturated or saturated fats or trans fats as well. But this has sort of opened the conversation that we've got lots of different fats that come in through the diet. And yes, it's part of energy provision, but it also kind of opens up the idea that there's other roles for fat in the body, including all of our membranes. And our membranes are constantly turning over, and our membranes are really important for cellular health. So it gets back to the idea of health and well-being as much as performance as well. So we can have a conversation now about fat and also types of fat, so that it becomes a positive conversation, because sometimes it can be just simply about, am I eating too much or too little of it, full stop, where we can actually sort of differentiate between the groups, and then also differentiate right down to different fatty acids potentially provide us with different health and well-being outcomes, which can translate through to potentially some performance outcomes for athletes as well.
Yeah, no, that's good insight, Greg. And leads us to the next question. I wanted to bring you into it, but could we just maybe talk about the research study that you did on the Omega-3 index with Nicola and Eliza? So what prompted that? Could you give us a quick overview, and then what prompted that study?
It's probably a good reminder as well about what the Omega-3 index is. Some people may have listened in or they may have heard before, but if we just step back and think about what it is, it's a measurement using the red blood cell. So we talked about the membranes being constantly in a turnover, and fatty acids are a really critical part. So they actually make up the layer inside that membrane, and we have transporters sitting inside, and obviously the membranes are the gatekeepers for things that move inside and outside of the cell. So if we take the red blood cell, for example, it's being produced every 120 days. So we're in this constant turnover. And what's interesting is that membrane of the red blood cell is then reflecting all of the different fats that we're taking in. So there's two parts that we can use it as a marker for longer term intake. So rather than what did I eat yesterday, it's what have I been consuming over the last 2, 3, 4 months. So it's really about long-term exposure of the different fats. And then in terms of the omega-3 index, we can look at those two polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And what we note is when that long-term intake increases over time, those two fatty acids in the red blood cells start to increase. The omega-3 index is the combination or the sum of those two fatty acids together. So as that goes up, there's more confidence that the intake is also increased over that period of time. So getting back to the practical part, the challenge is, never really actually understanding or knowing what someone puts in their mouth and eats. But this becomes a little bit more quantitative that you can kind of track over time and say, within reason, we know your intake is going up or down or staying the same. So the study we looked at is using that omega-3 index for longer term intake to determine what was the status. So this is going back about 2 years. I think we sort of came around through the Dragons and Rugby Australia, and without sort of any intentional intervention, just ask the question, what is the background omega-3 index? And, it could be that it could be high, it could be moderate, it could be low. And so in terms of those categories, we actually do have some numbers now that we use. So if we add those two fatty acids together, if it becomes less than 4% of the membrane, it's often quite low intake. If it's between 4 and 8% of the membrane, the intake's increasing, but it's kind of in the moderate range. And if it's above 8%, we know that the long-term intake is actually quite high. So it becomes a sort of more quantifiable kind of measure for determining that intake. So back to the rugby players, we just simply ask the question whether or not, if we took approximately 100 players, half from rugby union, half from rugby league, made up of 50% male and 50% female, what was the omega-3 index and how did that reflect in terms of the dietary intake? And some really interesting outcomes straight away, because we have to remember that we've been seeing this particular measure being taken since about 2014 in different athlete groups, but it's been very dominant to the North American scene, I guess is the best way of putting it, and the college scene. So, you think about college athletes, they're not necessarily the same as professional elite athletes in terms of their position of where they are in their career. And so we're in a position where we could sort of ask, does the Australian contact or rugby athlete differ to the North American? And also, just on a simple basis, what is the intake of omega-3, EPA and DHA in these groups? Being male and female was really interesting as well in terms of the difference, because our male athletes showed a slightly higher omega-3 index than our female group. And that sort of opened up some interesting conversations, because immediately you ask is, does the behavioural intake of what the males are eating differ? And what we also talking about is whole foods, things like marine-based products, seafood, tuna, fish as well, so as supplements. And so having a male group different to the female group was an immediate feedback. And the second is that the males on average were higher than what we've seen in the North Americans. Not perfect, but certainly higher. So there was this idea that at least at a baseline level, the conversation had probably occurred amongst some players, but there was a lot of room for improvement from that point of view.
Eliza, from your perspective, from Rugby Australia, were you surprised by the results?
I was. I didn't know really what to expect when we first tested our first batch of testing. What surprised me the most was the spectrum from the lowest measure to the highest measure. And then what I found really pleasantly surprised me was the interplay with diet quality and how that reflected in their results. So, athletes that I know from essentially living on the road with them for 6 months, potentially hadn't optimized their diet. They correlated with the athletes that had lower amounts, and those that had better diets had higher amounts and or supplementation in parallel. We also had an interesting sort of cluster of athletes that had either a history of concussion or had a recent sort of unresolving concussion or prolonged recovery period, and they were associated with lower omega-3 index, which I think, we're just starting to scratch the surface on potential sort of research with concussion and omega-3, and DHA specifically. But it just opened up this, whole area of an ability to be able to influence an athlete's nutrition habits and therefore create behaviour change. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And Nicola, from your perspective, your athletes, what was your observation in terms of how they engaged, with their biomarker results?
They initially, because we hadn't done this before, we didn't know a lot about it in our space, in our club. Initially, I don't think they really understood what it was about or what their levels meant. But I think as soon as they got those results back and there were other players who were higher, and then again we had that education piece around the levels and what they meant. Once that was in play, the boys were on board particularly. And there was more buy-in with their supplementation. There's, we do, because we are in the one location, I do place their supplements out every day. They've got them with their name and their little pill cup, and it's all available for them. Yet we still have some players who, for whatever reason, don't like to take them or might just forget a little too often. But there was definitely a better buy-in and uptake of particularly their supplementation, but also the food recommendations as well after they saw their levels, and knowing that they were going to have them retested also helped with their engagement within the process.
Because they know that they're going to get a
they want to do well.
They want to do well.
They want to compete.
I think just on that point, that was something that really resonated with me was, I'd been doing education on using a fish oil supplement and consuming, sources of omega-3 in their diets for a while. But it wasn't until the athletes got their own individual data that it really moved the needle, because it was just black and white. There was no grey. It wasn't subjective. It was you're either optimal or not. And that, I think when you take an athletic population that's already, a pretty motivated population, it just then, makes it a bit of a competition, even if it's just with themselves as well.
Yeah. And Greg, compared to these findings, how does it compare from what work you've done in terms of the general population and other athlete groups?
So that's a good point. So general population, particularly Western populations, we often see a low intake of EPA and DHA. That's reflected by a low omega-3 index. So when we talk about low, it's often between 3.5 to 4.5 on mass across the populations. And there's been some fantastic sort of general population maps then being produced where we see colour charts from around the world. Australia sort of sits roughly in the middle. It's not great. It's not the lowest, but certainly not the highest like we see in some of the more traditional countries that include marine-based products as part of their normal diet. The Japanese and the Scandinavian diets are sometimes that little bit higher, and therefore on population level it's a bit higher as well. In terms of athlete populations, as I said, we've seen decent amount of data out of the NCAA, North American environments. The first study that was ever done in athletes was 2014 from Clemens von Schacke, and he screened 106 endurance winter athletes. Essentially, they were biathletes and cross-country skiers, and they came out at about 4.8, 4.9. So again, German population in Europe, just simply reflecting the background population as well. We've now ended up with about 12 studies that have actually been collated into a systematic literature review that Jeff Hillison's published in the last 12 months. And if you take all of those studies, they're not all elite athletes, but they're been claimed to be trained individuals. The average is coming out in those groups at, again, about 4.8, 4.9, so a little below 5%. So what's interesting is when we screened the 100 rugby league and rugby union athletes here in Australia, the males in the cohort came out at just on 6%, so about 1% higher. The girls were a little bit lower, at just over 5%. And that's probably a reflection of potential access to supplements, for example, on the longer term basis. And then also potentially just behavioural food intake, of whether or not, canned fish, for example, is being used as a protein source as well. So not perfect, because 6% is kind of indicating that there's been a bit of a push to increase a little bit, which means that there's an increased awareness. But what it also means is some room to improve. So as we move from 6% up to 8%, we know the intakes are likely to be increasing towards 1,000 milligrams per day total, roughly. But ultimately what we're looking at probably in athletic populations is intake somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams per day in total. And so if you reflect back at the population, the average person in the population is only taking in about 150 to 200 milligrams. So we're talking about a 10-fold increase to move that omega-3 index from 4 or 5% up into that 8 to 10%. The other complexity of this is every athlete is different in terms of their energy expenditure. Different athletes have different body sizes. So all these factors are going to play in as well. But encouragingly, what we're seeing is probably that first evidence on an Australian basis that we're just that fractionally higher or better than a lot of the data that's already been published in this area, which is a good thing. We're starting to move it a little bit here just because of the work that obviously our sports dietitians are doing here in Australia.
Yeah. And so, Eliza and Nicola, just in terms of the practical takeaways from this study, what takeaways are there for sports dietitians and performance teams that come out of this study that you see?
The takeaways for me have been, if you can test, please do, because the power that has to influence behaviour change with the athlete is real. And we don't want to assume, however, the research is telling us that it's likely the athletes have suboptimal levels even without testing, based on the way that food access is changing in Australia and the types of foods that athletes are consuming, but also just the volume of food that they require. And as an extension of that, the amount of omega-3 foods that they need to eat to have optimal levels is quite a lot. So testing enables us to be able to get a little bit more targeted about how we prescribe omega-3 food and supplements.
From your perspective?
I think even just for sports dietitians specifically, this is not something we necessarily learn about in our training, or still to this day, I don't think there's enough education for sports dietitians in this area. So ensuring that you upskill a little bit in your knowledge around omega-3s and particularly DHA, but also if you can test, it's within your budget to do the testing. Every other area of performance has data. They collect a lot of data. It backs up their decisions. It helps to reinforce their prescriptions and the interventions that they're doing to show that they're successful. And this is a really nice way for sports dietitians to do that, because we don't have a lot of ways that we can collect objective data. So if we can do this and we can show, yes, the supplement prescriptions that we're making are successful in increasing their levels, we can see that their dietary intervention is successful in improving their health, their diet quality, their membrane of the cells and all that sort of stuff. It's a really nice tool that we can use in this space to support our work as well.
Yeah. So can I ask you, from a science perspective and also from a practical perspective, are there any specific benchmarks or targets for omega-3 index, ranges in terms of for elite athletes that you like to see?
This is a good question, because at the moment, we'd like to be a little bit more targeted with athletes, but we need more research. At Rugby Australia, we operate off the omega-3 index, so a target of 8% or above. However, I think Greg has a lot of more questions about how, is that influenced by body weight? Is that influenced by, energy expenditure? And does that then mean we need to be more prescriptive with doses? We don't know yet. So at the moment, I'm targeting at 8% or above.
We're the same for our athletes, but definitely there's some individual variation. So if there are a group of our players who haven't successfully been able to increase their omega-3 index, they're getting better towards that 8%, but even with supplementation, it's been difficult for them. So just like anything, working on an individual level, and just for them, ensuring we can keep going in the right direction is enough.
Did you see, in your case, you're dealing with both male and female athletes. Did you see a difference between the two?
Yes. A difference in that I believe that it came down to access. Our female athletes aren't full-time athletes. They're not there for they're only there for a few months. And traditionally, they also haven't had access to supplementation or education the way that the male squad has. Our men's squad has been supplementing with omega-3s for as long as I've been there, 6 seasons, not necessarily from a very evidence-based back there. We just knew it was probably good for them. So we've given it to them, throw everything at them that we can that might make a difference. But over the years, it's been really nice to work with Greg and the team at the uni to be able to solidify that prescription around the omega-3 supplementation, to know that it's actually really making a difference. But our female athletes, when they were educated around food and they had access to supplementation, we did see levels increase.
Yeah, so in terms of target ranges, this is the infinite question that we've got. So the index itself is based on historically cardiovascular outcomes. So that 4% to 8%, 8% and above has been very much targeted on intakes then are associated with changes to the function of the heart or the function of the blood vessels, and more broadly cardiovascular physiology, cardiovascular risk, cardiovascular health overall. But it does, because of the principle that that index, being the red blood cell, is also tracking lots of different tissues in the body, we can then obviously use that to track that the intake is going in the right direction. The questions that we now have is, does that 8% that has historically been related around cardiovascular function, is that now translating out as the same types of levels if we're talking about muscle function or joint health or brain health or brain physiology, for example, in other systems or tissues? So that's actually where a lot of the questions are going to be kind of asked. And the other point about it is that we also know that there's a different intake range potentially for different people as well. So a lot of the research has been about giving the same dose to everybody, and that means we get the variation that one person ends up at 11%, another person still is at 7.8%, and they're not quite there. The alternative is that we'll be looking towards actually what does it take in terms of the variation in intake to get everybody to, for example, 10%, and how does that then impact on something that we're interested in? So it could be muscle soreness, it could be resting heart rate, it could be brain health in the future. So at least the 8% gives us really good, I guess, confidence that the intake is heading in the right direction. The next point will be, how do we potentially reassign different levels to different outcomes beyond what it was traditionally designed for, which is obviously going to give us a lot to work with in the next decade or so.
Yeah. I just want to ask, in this study, what was the format that you provided the athletes to take the Omega-3? Was it a capsule or what was
Well, so this one, the first study was a screening study. So it was just dependent on exactly what was already happening in the environment. So there was no specific intervention per se. It was coming in, doing a screening and saying what's ecologically already happening. We've done other studies after that, actually providing capsules, but this very first study was just, let's just see what's happening right now without actually intending to do anything specific in a study itself. The teams potentially, like has already been talked about, already kind of playing around with these fatty acids, whether it's promoting a little bit more seafood intake or providing some access. But obviously through personal choice, we have some players that may have not actually taken that on board, and so they might have been quite low, others are quite high. It looks like on average, compared again to what we've seen elsewhere, that there has been already at this point, this is about 2 years ago, there was already uptake in engagement and thinking, but it's not broadly across every single player, is the best way of putting it.
Good. Well, just to wrap up, just want to ask Eliza and Nicola, if there's a young sort of sports nutritionist listening today, what advice would you give them about integrating DHA into sort of a performance nutrition strategy?
I think Nicola sort of hit the nail on the head earlier. Seek to understand and make sure you understand it and educate yourself before you're going to educate others, because it is an area that we haven't had a lot of education in, but it doesn't mean you can't. And it is a pretty sort of powerful area of sports nutrition, so it's one, worth upskilling in.
And I think just being confident to have discussions with your team and the people that you're working with to see what the scope is to integrate it into the systems that you already have, even if that's just some education, or if you don't have a budget for supplementation, for example, it could just be just drip feeding it in small ways to start with before you can build up to testing and supplementation, for example.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eliza, Nicola and Greg. It was an insightful episode, and we'll look forward to the next session.
Thanks, Bassam.
Thanks, Bassam. Thanks
to Greg, Nicola and Eliza for such an insightful discussion today. We explored how sports nutrition has evolved in elite environments, how DHA is becoming more intentional part of performance planning, and what the Omega-3 Index study revealed about the status of professional rugby athletes. We also touched on the practical implications of dietitians from education and food-first strategies, setting meaningful omega-3 targets for athletes. Stay tuned for our next episode where we shift from understanding DHA roles to exploring how actually optimize omega-3 status across different sporting contexts and what the future of research and applied practice might look like.
DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle